Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and when American Jews think about the obstacles to a two-state solution with the Palestinians, they tend to frame the issue in terms of land and borders. How much of the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, should become the Palestinian state? And where should the new borders between the two states be to guarantee Israel's security? That's why many American Jews who support the idea of a two-state solution tend to oppose Israeli communities on the West Bank, commonly and mistakenly called settlements, and even more adamantly oppose any new Israeli communities on the West Bank because, they argue, these communities will take up more land that would belong to the Palestinians in a two-state solution, and by gobbling up more and more West Bank land, Israel makes it less likely that the Palestinians would agree to a two-state solution. Now, there are many American Jews, and many Israelis for that matter, who believe this entire construct is a fantasy, because they're now convinced, after the collapse of Oslo in the blood of Intifada, that the existing Palestinian leadership, certainly Hamas, and to many Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority as well, the existing Palestinian leadership will never agree to a meaningful two-state solution in which a Palestinian state will be ready to live in peace alongside an acknowledged Jewish state in the same way that Canada lives alongside the United States. They hear the Palestinian chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And they believe it's what the Palestinians really and only want. And therefore, it's pointless to worry about the amount of West Bank land needed for a two-state solution, and that therefore, there's no reason to curtail establishing Jewish communities on the West Bank. It's also why there's a serious consideration now of Israeli annexation of at least parts of the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, especially in what's known as Area C, which refers to the area of the West Bank where the majority of Israelis now live and which would be expected to be part of any two-state solution if a two-state solution ever comes to be. That's how most American Jews frame the two-state solution, in terms of land and resulting borders. But they're missing something very important. In fact, in many ways, it's this missing piece which Palestinians claim is the reason for all of the failed peace offers made by prime ministers in the past, especially the offer of Ehud Barak at Bill Clinton's Camp David in the year 2000, and the missing piece that is the elephant in the room. That is a Palestinian right of return. Arafat then and Abbas now, all Palestinian leadership insist that any peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians include the right of Palestinian refugees throughout the world to return to their homes in what they call Palestine, what we call Israel. For Israel, any significant right of Palestinian return is understood to be a demographic end to the Jewish state. And so while prime ministers like Barak and Ehud Olmert offered the Palestinians more than 90% of the West Bank in a two-state solution, including East Jerusalem as the capital of the new Palestinian state. The deal was rejected by the Palestinians because it did not include a right of Palestinian return. American Jews tend only to look at the issue of land and say, look, Israel was prepared to give up more than 90% of the West Bank, and the Palestinians refused to take it. But the Palestinians say, the plan didn't include our right of return. Now again, many are convinced the notion of any two-state solution is moot because the Palestinians really don't want a two-state solution that would include a Jewish state. They want all the land because they believe all the land was theirs and is theirs forever. And even when Palestinians talk of a two-state solution, they mean a Palestinian state alongside a binational state, not a Jewish state. But one thing is clear from the Palestinian perspective: any two-state solution must include a right of Palestinian return, which from a Jewish-Israeli perspective is simply unacceptable. And that obstacle to peace is one that American Jews often fail to understand. And oddly enough, it's something that many Israelis fail to understand as well. Which brings me to a book that is a huge bestseller in Israel and which now has been translated into English. It's entitled The War of Return: How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has Obstructed the Path to Peace. It's a book that suggests America and other Western powers have not made it clear to the Palestinians that there will never be a significant right of Palestinian return. And because American and Western nations have failed to make this clear to the Palestinians believe the West will ultimately impose a right of Palestinian return on Israel. And therefore the Palestinians refuse to give up this demand. The book, The War of Return, is superbly comprehensive in its look at this facet of Palestinian demands. There are nearly 40 pages of footnotes at the back of the book. And it's the outstanding work of two Israelis, each of whom brings an intimate understanding of the heart of the issue. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce them to you. Einat Wilf, a former Knesset member in the Labor Party and a leading Israeli intellectual, and Adi Schwartz, one of Israel's foremost journalists, who used to write for Haaretz and who's recognized as an authority in the Israeli-Arab conflict, as well as social, cultural, and historical issues relating to Israel and the Middle East. And Einat and Adi, first, Mazal Tov on your book, The War of Return. And thank you so much for joining us from Israel on JBS. I am most grateful. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
So before we talk about the issues raised in your book, I want to know a little bit about each of you. Einat, I want to begin with you. Einat, where were you born and what kind of Jewish household did you grow up in?
So I was born in Beit HaKerem, a secular neighborhood in the western part of Jerusalem. I call it humdrum, boring neighborhood, nothing holy, nothing to fight over. That's part of Jerusalem too. And the social, political surrounding in that neighborhood, the area where I grew up at the time, was very much associated with the Israeli Labor Party. And as a result, as a young adult, when I grew up into the Labor Party politics. And in the 80s and 90s, very much the politics of the Labor Party being my own, the belief in the possibility of peace to be attained through a land for peace formula.
And in general, has that remained your orientation? And do you still consider yourself to be on the left of the Israeli spectrum?
I very much still consider myself on the Israeli left, taken me on all issues from feminism to my known atheism commitment to a secular Israel. I'm very much on the left. But and the book is the outcome of the sad and painful recognition that the simplicity of the Land for Peace formula was not going to lead us in this case to peace, and we need to look deeper into how the Palestinians view the conflict.
Okay, thank you so much. Adi, same questions to you. Where were you born and what kind of Jewish household did you grow up in?
So I was born in Petach Tikva, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv. I was born to a middle-class family, generally speaking, a secular family, with no strong political activism. But I think that the atmosphere in the 80s when I grew up and being a young person, I think the overall feeling was that somehow Israeli politics was stuck and was led by quite older people. Now, at my age, I look at the term old a little bit different. But I think that's what led me in the beginning of the 90s, when it was my first time to vote. I also voted to leftist parties, as I identified with most of their positions vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict, state and religion, etc., etc. All these issues brought me to be identified with the left.
And I ask also the same question of you. Do you consider yourself to still be in the same relative political position, or do you feel you've moved at all?
So this is actually a question that I don't like to answer, and I'll explain why. Especially in these times in Israel, and I think the same is true to the United States, there's this desire to know whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right. And then you automatically kind of stuck in this position where you have the attention of half of your listeners, but then you lose completely the attention of the other half. And to be honest, I certainly find some very well points that are still relevant in the left, but I also think that many things that people on the right are saying is also true. So if I'm really, really pressed and I have to answer, I consider myself to be centrist. But to be honest, I prefer to be free of those tags of whether you're a leftist or a rightist. I would like to remain free on a certain issue to be closer to the left and on another issue to be closer to the right. And there are those issues. So sometimes I'm closer to here and sometimes closer to there.
I can understand you're saying, on some issues I lean left, some issues I lean right, and you were kind enough to basically say that you're a centrist. And Einat is saying she tends to still lean left, although she has different feelings today than she did about the peace process when she was younger. But you have written a book, and the reader has a right to know what your tendent is. And if I read a book, I don't care who it's by, I want to know what the perspective of the author is, because very often the perspective is a factor in how an author presents an argument. And so, Adi, if it turned out you said to me, you know what, I moved and now I consider myself on the far right. Well, that would factor into how I read your book. And if you said to me, you know what, I'm still on the far left, that would factor into the way I read your book. And that's the way that I believe, Adi, that that's true for you as well. And you've written for Haaretz, and that is not a paper that is centrist in any way. So that I would argue with you, and again, in some way this is unnecessary because you've already said you're a centrist, but I want you to understand that I think the question is a valid question, and I think if you're asked it again, you should at least understand why the question is important to whomever you're speaking to.
I can certainly see your point, and I'm asked this question again and again. Certainly, if we talk about the issue of the book and of the Arab-Israeli conflict, I certainly moved from positions I held 20 or 25 years ago, and as I said, I'm much more centrist, and I think that we will have this opportunity to expand on this. But I do think if we are going into it already, I do think that there's a difference between just a general attachment to a position. So someone is on the left and has always been on the left. His parents voted for the left. His grandparents voted for the left. So that's already an emotional attachment.
Yes.
Whereas I think, if I can attest about myself, and I think Einat as well, reality on the ground. Some very important things that have changed, and you have mentioned some of them, like the peace proposals by Ehud Barak and later on by Ehud Olmert. These are the things that changed my mind, and I think Einat as well. So reality on the ground changed. We have come to understand and we have come to realize certain facts which we were didn't think so in the 80s and the 90s. But there were also some Palestinian actions who led us and proved essential that we go back to our thoughts and rethink them. So reality changed our minds. It's not just like a general discussion of I fan football players, or this one likes Hapoel and the other one likes Maccabi, and that's it. We're talking about serious fact checking and seeing what's going on. But in a sense, the important point here is that the point of departure of both of us was the question of why there is no peace. So for so many years, Israel has been trying to get peace. We have these endless rounds of negotiations, secretaries of state coming and going, flying in and around. The peace proposal are supposedly exactly what the Palestinians want. So what's happening here? And not once, even twice, and perhaps more. So this is the departure point. And then you go and look to the history. So what's exactly going on here? What is it exactly that the Palestinians want? This is exactly, if I go back to your introduction, that we came to understand that this issue of refugees, while we thought it's over and done with, for the Palestinians, not at all. For the Palestinians, it's a very serious issue. It's the central issue. And then we decided that we have to analyze it from step one, going back to 1948, etc., see how it developed. So this is actually if you want to know the departure point for the book, so it's looking for the reason why there is no peace.
Beautifully said. And by the way, I'm going to say it again. It is a wonderful book you've written, and nobody has written this book before. So, kol hakavod to both of you. By the way, Einat, you heard my introduction, and you heard me say that to some extent, it's not simply American Jews who do not understand how important the issue of right of return is for the Palestinians, and why that's an enormous problem and obstacle to any peace agreement. But you also heard me say that there are Israelis who don't understand. Do you think I am correct when I say it? And to the extent that I am correct, how can an Israeli not see this? And how can an Israeli not understand how critical a piece of Palestinian demands the idea of right of return is?
So it's a combination of two things. First, I think today, due to the processes that Adi described, most Israelis viscerally and intuitively understand it, even though they might not have the knowledge or the intellectual knowledge that we put in the book. So having seen Palestinians walk away from two concrete opportunities to end the occupation, establish a sovereign Palestinian state with no settlements in sight, with a capital in East Jerusalem, including parts of the Old City, and to follow that up with blood and mayhem and suicide bombings, Israelis viscerally understood that if Palestinians walked away from those opportunities, they clearly want something else, and that something else is much more than what Israelis can give. So I think that broad, visceral, intuitive understanding is today common to most Israelis.
But you wrote a book, the two of you, that I understand has been a huge bestseller in Israel because Israelis feel you're telling them something new. Am I wrong, Adi?
No, you're not wrong. And to add to what Einat said, first of all, I think that our book gives a very deep and wide and going back to the past, factual basis to these feelings. So when you go deeper into the trajectory of this problem and the main milestones of how it was perpetuated, this problem, mainly by the West and by the United Nations, then people who feel that in their guts, as Einat said, have the facts and the basis to fill in those feelings. And I want to add something. I think there's a difference between the wider public, which I agree with Einat that there's a general understanding, and you can see it in the polls, and you can see it in the elections. I mean, the Labour Party, who had 44 seats in the Knesset in the days of Yitzhak Rabin, is now practically 2 seats in the Knesset. So that's such a dramatic change in just 25 years means something. It means that the basic presumption of the left in Israel, of the Labour Party in Israel, which was land for peace and attempts to achieve that formula, simply evaporated. So people understand they don't vote anymore to the Labour. That's the best proof that you have. But I do think that there is a tendency among academics, some politicians, think tankers. There's a smaller strata, which I don't think is represented in the public, in the wider public, but there you will see less understanding, in my view, of the centrality of the refugee issue. Many people, I think, in too many places, if you ask me, still cling to that illusion that the problem is mainly about land, that if Israel would have given a better option or a better proposal, then we might have been somewhere else. I still think that among some elite circles, you will find it something that you don't find in a wider public.
By the way, did the two of you find that you learned something in all of your research for this book about pre-state Israel and how pre-state Israel and then Israel as it emerged into being treated Palestinians?
So one of the things that, I think I actually knew, but it was important to research and to especially convey to the English reader, is that by now, after years of a propaganda effort, a lot of people think that the War of 1948 looked pretty much something like this. In 1948, a peaceful state of Palestine existed. And then Jews and Zionists in Israel, with the Israeli Defense Forces that already existed then, and already then had F-16 and tanks, invaded the territory and went about ethnically cleansing the peaceful and entirely passive population. So even though I know it's not true, I realize the extent to which we need to put the War of 1948 back in context. We need to let people feel as they read what it means to be at war, why people leave houses, why some people were expelled in wars, why it's not this some kind of deliberate invasion and expulsion, but this war between two warring sides where one side makes it very clear that they want the other side not to survive, and the other side, the Jews, are very clear that they're fighting a war of survival and have to protect every house, every home. So for us, I think it was very important, first of all, to show what the War of 1948 was really like, and then also put it in international context to actually show that there was nothing special in this war. There was nothing particularly brutal, nothing particularly evil. I mean, war is terrible, but the War of 1948 is not so terrible or unique or different that it could justify the existence of millions of refugees decades and decades after the war is over.
By the way, would one of you like to explain to our audience the difference in the way the United Nations and the world treats refugees in general and how they treat Palestinian refugees in a totally unique and distinct way? Would one of you do that for me?
So one of the things that we really highlight in the book is how unique is the Western and UN indulgence of the Palestinian notion that they are refugees from a war that has ended. The entire 20th century is a pretty bloody century, and in the transition from empire to nation states, which characterizes that century, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, become refugees. States emerge, borders are established, people flee, people are expelled brutally, such as Germans, Ukrainians, Poles. They are not refugees today. They are not refugees today because the international norm throughout the 20th century was war is hell, but you move on. You don't look back. You move on, you build a new life in the new territory wherever you are, and you move on.
Are descendants of refugees in general counted as refugees?
In general, no. You have specific cases where in a specific family, if the children are still dependent on the original refugees, they may receive protection together by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. But what UNRWA does for Palestinians, which is by now into the 5th generation, automatically blanket registration of all descendants as refugees still from the War of 1948, not as a case-by-case basis, as it's done for all other refugees, in perpetuity, and especially while rejecting every other effort to move forward, to integrate locally, to resettle. That is unparalleled. That is only for the Palestinians.
Why do you think that is, Einat? Why has the United Nations crafted one definition for Palestinian refugees that is unlike the definition for any other group on the face of the earth?
So historically, the difference in refugee definition that UNRWA uses, which is really one that just has to do with living 2 years in the territory and losing a livelihood and homes, it was an operational definition at the moment intended to help people. Nobody imagined it would be used 70 years later to continue the idea that these people are still refugees. And the reason that it is held, I mean, UNRWA just celebrated 70 years of existence. It's something that they should be ashamed of, not proud of, because they are still, after 70 years, a temporary agency, which should have closed down after 3 or 4 years, having settled everybody. But they keep this alive. And the reason is, and we showed historically, is that the Arabs wanted to keep the War of 1948 open. As far as they were concerned, the fact that the Jewish people succeeded in defending their state and coming into being was an unacceptable outcome that they were determined to undo. And one way of undoing it was by keeping the refugee issue alive and not moving on as all other refugees. And the reason that the UN and the West indulged in it is because pretty much the Arab world, with its oil, threatened the West to cave in.
And to what extent does the average Israeli understand exactly what you've just described?
So again, I think that those who read our book understand now better. But
Right.
I think that one of the problems that we had for so many years is that this issue of refugees was somehow out of sight. So we have endless discussions and maps. And by the way, even now, these days, when the question of the Trump peace plan and whether there will be annexation or not, the details about this exact amount of territory that will be here and where would be the borders, as you just said in the introduction, the endless hours and discussions that we have on this issue, if you compare it to the scarcity of discussions, books, research papers, etc., on the issue of refugees. Now just imagine you have at least 10 times more refugees registered than the number of settlers. I'm not saying that the territorial issue is not an issue, but I'm just saying that we're not getting 10 times more coverage of the refugees. We hardly ever have any discussion. Now, this goes back to the delusion that we had that this is a foregone issue. I mean, most Israelis, especially those who led that effort, suppose that if Palestinians are negotiating for a two-state solution, they clearly understand that no return is going to happen. So the astonishment, I think, that when PLO and Yasser Arafat came back from 2000 from the Camp David summit, and when they rejected the Clinton parameters, and they said it, and we show it in the book, that they will never give up their right of return, and they won't be the first nation to give up the right of return, whereas there is no such a thing, that it's complete false that they would be the first, because practically there isn't such a thing. So what I'm saying is that this issue of the refugees and UNRWA, the agency that perpetuates their position, is only hardly getting the spotlight, and that's exactly what we try to do in the book, to shed some light on how it developed and the detrimental effect of that agency on the number of refugees and on any chance to reach peace in the near future.
So I ask you both, Adi and Einat, if the Palestinians were ever to give up the demand for a significant, the demand is they want a complete right of return of Palestinians, and it obviously would overwhelm the state of Israel demographically. It is something clearly impossible in a viable two-state solution. But if the Palestinians ever gave up that demand, are the Palestinians ready to make peace if you took the Palestinian issue of right of return off, or is from the river to the sea a position which makes, at the moment, everything we're talking about irrelevant?
But it's the same thing. There's no such thing as giving up the right of return, but then not making peace. No, the willingness to make peace will be reflected in their willingness to acknowledge that they do not possess a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel.
This is the reason why we decided to write a book about the refugees and not just generally about the peace process. Or what we're trying to say is that the refugee issue is not just another technical issue that you have to solve. So we have these security demands. Where exactly will we put, NATO forces or whatever, and how many refugees will be given access back? No, the issue of refugees opens a window to the entire worldview of the Palestinians. I mean, the fact that they are the only group on earth that are still refugees after 72 years is exactly because they have this vision that the creation of the state of Israel in 1948 was an unjust act, that basically Arabs and Muslims own this land in its entirety, and that Jews at the maximum can be a minority under Muslim rule. So this is not a technical issue that can be solved without connection to the entire worldview of the Palestinians. It crystallizes, it symbolizes, we think, in the best way, the entire framework of how Palestinians look at the conflict and the reason why we can't solve it. I mean, one must ask himself or herself, what's so unique about them? I mean, as Einat just said, there were tens of millions of refugees. So how come Germans do they have their blood is of different color, or what makes them so unique? And you have in India and Pakistan and all over the world. What's so unique about the Palestinian case? And that is exactly the answer. The answer is the political rejection of the existence of the state of Israel.
Yes.
So you cannot differentiate and say one thing is the right of return and another thing is peace or something else. This is connected. Everything goes together.
Einat used the word consensus. And it's interesting, there are many in the American community who argue that the Palestinian people would be quite willing to live in peace with the state of Israel without a right of return. Just let them create their own society and let them live in peace alongside the state of Israel. And it's all about the Palestinian leadership. Would you use the word consensus to suggest that it's not simply Palestinian leadership, but that the Palestinian ideology has so infected and affected the rank and file Palestinian ordinary citizen, that it's not simply the leadership that will not make peace with Israel right now, but that the truth is it's the Palestinian people as a whole who see things, Adi, just as you've described them.
Yes, I think it is certainly the latter. One of the myths, when we worked on this book, we had to deal with all kinds of myths. And one of them is very familiar to you, I think, and to everybody who's watching the news, that on the one hand, you have the population, which is, more pragmatic, less ideological, etc. And then you have the leadership, which is somehow, being described as corrupt sometimes more extreme. But what we found is that, if anything, in the Palestinian case, then perhaps even the leadership is more moderate than the population, because you just have to listen to them. And I'll give you a few examples and a few proofs. First of all, where is the opposition? By now, we are 25 years into the peace process. You have many Palestinians living in free countries, such as the United States. Not all of them, you could say that Hamas, perhaps, you can't be free to express your views. Okay, but you have Palestinians in Europe and in America. And if anything, those people are always the more extreme voices, demanding that the PLO and the PA leadership never ceases to demand the right of return. And we were looking for an op-ed, an NGO, someone, a politician. Arafat came back from the Camp David summit. Did somebody ask him or, challenge him? Why did you do that? Don't you think it's time after the 70 years or maybe 150 years that we move on? The same happened in 2008. We are not aware of any opposition to this position. So it is not just an extreme leadership. And there are many other examples that we give in the book. Already in the 50s, the fiercest opposition to any attempt of resettlement, of going back to life, was rejected by the Palestinians themselves. So there was no leader who told them, don't do this or do this. And I think, generally speaking, this tendency perhaps make us or, offers us the quick way out. Okay, let's just change the leadership and everything will be all right. And another example I'll give you that a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, people in Gaza started marching to the border. They called it March of Return. They specifically called it marches of return.
Mhm.
And they said, and if you look into their, they published, they say everything. You know, this was ordinary people, and the people who organized these protests wrote in their manifesto, we want to cross the border into Israel because we believe that all the land is ours. And what we want to do is regain the village. So it was very clear. And then one day we were looking at it and laughing that you saw a reportage in the New York Times. It was a video reportage. And the New York Times reporter is going around asking inside Gaza, walking around and asking people there, why did you come here? What are you doing here? And they, again and again, one after the other, they say, well, we march for return and we march and we want to go into Israel. And then the reporter simply moves to the camera and says, well, yes, as you can see, people here want to make their lives better. They want to lift the siege. They want a better standards of living. So it seems that he even, I don't know, either he didn't listen or he's uncomfortable with the answer. Einat has a word for it that I'm sure she'd be glad to explain. And this is exactly the situation we're in, that I don't think there's a difference between the leadership and the population. If anything, I believe the population is even more adamant.
Very, very interesting. By the way, Einat, what's your word?
The word I invented and we include in the book, I call it West-plaining.
Yes.
Which, like mansplaining, betrays an attitude where someone knows what the other person should be thinking. And West-plaining is the word invented for Western diplomats and journalists who explain away what Palestinians have clearly said. And one of the things I'm most proud of in the book is that I actually think it respects the Palestinians by listening to what they're saying, taking them at their word, and respecting them as historical agents who know what they're fighting for, and also not thinking that they can be just bribed away from what they think is a truly just and noble cause. And in that sense, our book has a very simple message. There are no shortcuts. The Land for Peace shortcut doesn't exist. The Just Change the Leadership shortcuts doesn't exist. There is a path to peace. We don't say in the book that it'll never happen. There is a path to peace, but it's much longer. It might take years, decades, generations, but there is a path to peace if we deal with the core issue rather than continuing to look for shortcuts that actually just make the conflict much, much longer.
Okay, so you have to tell our audience what you suggest in the book is a path to peace. And now, what's a path to peace that's realistic?
Let me first say, at the end of the day, between the river and the sea, there are two collective communities, Jews and Arabs, who I believe will both benefit from governing themselves on their own in separate political entities. To get to that point, the Palestinian and Arab side need to accept and acknowledge that the Jewish sovereign presence, known as the State of Israel, is here to stay and will not be undone. They need to get a very simple message that all of the refugees in the world got throughout the 20th century. The war is over. Move on. We show how other groups of refugees, when they receive the message, whether within 5 years or 25 years, finally moved on. When they will hear their message again and again and again, we believe there at least is a chance that then a leadership can emerge that will tell the Palestinians it's time to move on, it's time to make peace with Israel as is, and then we know that they will find a willing and ready Jewish partner, Israeli partner for that message.
Okay, so I want to now come to the subtitle of your book, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Would one of you tell me why in the world sophisticated diplomats, just in the United States, don't understand how simple the point you are making is and how effective it could be in moving the Palestinians and the Palestinian people if they really, if they believed that there was no option, they might, I'm not as sure as you are, Einat, that they would. The Arab mentality is, we'll just wait you out. And we don't care if it takes 100 years or 200 years or 500 years. At the same time, they might be willing to make a Hudaybiyah with the children, with the state of Israel, where they would accept some kind of working peace that would allow the state of Israel to live and the Palestinians to live for a period of time in some form of non-belligerent side-by-sideness. But I'm asking you, why has the United States, administration after administration, with the possible exception now of the Trump administration, why have they not understood the simple, important truth? You have made this point throughout your entire book. It's time to tell the Palestinian people, the war is over, you're not having a return, you want to move on with your life, make peace with the state of Israel. Tell me why the American administration, the State Department, and not why hasn't that never happened till this point in history?
We offer several answers in the book, but it is still very much a question. The easiest answer is in the 1950s. In the 1950s, the Americans caved into Arab pressure for very serious reasons. The Arab world was united in its demand. They threatened to go to, or there was fear that they would go to the Soviet bloc. Oil was very important for the American economy and the reconstruction of Europe. So if keeping UNRWA open, bribing the Arab world, funding it $100, $200 million a year, if that was the price of appeasing the Arab world, that's the Eisenhower doctrine, so be it. We get it. And I think you're right that the American president, I think, intuitively understood that the same conditions that existed in the 1950s do not exist today. The Arab world is not united, not even in its position to Israel. Oil is not what it used to be. The Soviet Union is gone. So I think the American administration understood that they can withdraw their support of UNRWA and this endless indulgence of the Palestinian maximalism with no repercussions. And they were proved correct. What we hope is that the message will be moved to Europe, Australia, Japan, other countries, that there are no longer any repercussions for dismantling UNRWA. There are good alternatives. We believe it is high time for this message to be sent. And we think also it's a good time for this message to be sent because of the changing geopolitical circumstances.
I want to tell you what we also hear in America, and I'd love to hear either or both of you respond. You've made reference to this, the extent to which it is striking that there are no op-eds being written by Palestinian intellectuals who call Abbas to task the way Israelis call Netanyahu to task. There's a very strong vocal left in Israel that's very critical of the current administration and past administrations, and there has been a Shalom Achshav, a Peace Now movement indigenous to Israel, all of which was significant in terms of the way in which the Israeli people debate and grapple with how to make peace with the Palestinians. We have not seen anything like that on the Palestinian side. Very often we're told that's because a Palestinian, whoever would make such a claim or who would try to start a Palestinian Shalom Achshav, he would be killed. And therefore we have to be understanding, and we have to realize that the Palestinian is not in the same position as the Israeli, which is interesting to me because people who make that distinction don't normally then make the distinction of the character of the existing Palestinian regime as opposed to the Israeli government. But there are those who argue that there are indeed Palestinians in the Palestinian larger community, very many of whom do live outside of Palestine, out of the entire Middle East, who are of the same mentality that you are, and who do want the Palestinians to make compromises that will bring peace to their people. And those people, the argument goes, should be supported and nurtured and protected by a state of Israel which has all of the power, the military power and the strength of power. And if Israel were to do more to nurture and to support Palestinian voices which in some way echo everything you've said, there would be a movement to peace. And because Israel does not support and nurture these Palestinian voices, Israel is held guilty for obstructing and preventing the peace process from moving forward. I would like to hear either of both of you speak to that issue.
Well, in order for Israel to support those voices, they first have to exist. And again, all the voices, again, outside of the Middle East, okay? Let's say that in the Middle East, we have a problem of freedom of speech. But again, if anything, by now 25 years of negotiations, the voices coming out of the United States and from Europe are always even more extreme than the leadership. So we would be, I think both Einat and myself would be very supportive of such voices. So just to be clear, we would like to find those voices. I completely agree with the argument. So if there would be a substantive, a constituency outside of the Middle East, inside the Middle East, as much as possible. By the way, this is exactly the job of the European Union, of anyone who wants to, have constructive building, to build some environment of peace in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, or in the Gaza Strip. This is exactly what they should do. You're
suggesting these voices don't really exist?
Exactly. They don't exist. I mean, I would be happy to read anywhere. We always in our lectures are asked about this, and where are those? Give me their addresses. We would be very happy to meet them, to have coffee with them, to discuss this issue. But I think that this is, as Einat said before, this is the broadest consensus in the Palestinian society. And by the way, you said something very interesting about Shalom Achshav. In the Israeli society, you will hardly, I don't think, almost, you will not find criticism about Israel's decision not to let Palestinian refugees into Israel. You will find Shalom Achshav usually talks about settlements, usually talks about the territorial issues. But perhaps 1% of Jewish Israelis will talk about return of refugees, but 99% of Israeli Jews are not suicidal. Perhaps they still think that the issue is territorial, so they think, okay, Israel should have done more. But you will not find Israelis who think that the right of return is a good idea. In that sense, this is a consensus in the Israeli society, and it's a mirror image of the complete consensus in the Palestinian society that this is the crucial issue and it must happen.
Einat, do you answer it the same way that Adi did, that you simply don't believe these people exist?
It's not a question of belief. If anything, Israelis trips over when we even hear the beginning of such a voice. I sometimes liken Israelis to eager teenager who gets half a text and says, she loves me. I mean, Palestinians have said barely anything, and we interpret it, West Plain it, to say, look, they're moderate, they want peace, they gave up the right of return, when they literally say no such thing. So we, sometimes in our talks when people say, oh, you're generalizing, there must be other voices. Our argument is just like in science, you only need one counter example to disprove us. So please do disprove us. Where are the people? Where are the voices? Where's the single op-ed by a Palestinian who lives in Sweden in an open society and writes that it's time to move on? If anything, Israel does everything to support these voices. The Arab world, voices in the Arab world right now, in the Gulf, in Saudi, where they speak clearly about changing their worldview on Israel. And when they want to change their worldview, they know how to speak. They're not being kind of vague about it. They're very clear about it, which is why more and more of us believe that at least with the Gulf states, with Saudi, there is a greater hope of peace. And by the way, they're telling Palestinians what no Westerner dare say. They're telling them the message that we think the West should also join in saying, that the war is over, that they're done sustaining it, that Palestinians have rejected too many opportunities, that Israel is here to stay, and they're even speaking in the name of Islam, which Saudis can do, and they say Islam has no problems with Jews in the region, we accept all three scriptures. So when they want to speak clearly, they certainly know how, and you see that Israel embraces these voices, doesn't run away from them at all.
Before we end, I want to ask a different kind of question. On your book, there's a jacket cover. Are you responsible for what the flap jacket says on the inside cover?
Nothing was placed there without us working on it.
Okay, good. Then here's what it says, and I want you to explain to me what you're trying to convey. The inside jacket says, in 1948, 700,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes. I want to know from the two of you, were there Palestinians in 1948? Because all of history says there weren't. And I wondered why in the world you would use that word, and how were they forced? And the reason why both of these questions are so critical is that there's an underlying philosophical problem for many liberal American Jews who really feel what Israel is the creation of something on the back of another people. And I'm sure both of you are aware of the book written by Israeli journalist Ari Shavit, My Promised Land, which when it was written was a huge hit in America. It was not written for Israelis, it was written in English for American Jews. And the premise of Ari Shavit's book, My Promised Land, is that his great-grandfather came to early pre-state Palestine on a fact-finding mission for Theodor Herzl, and that Bentwich was so enamored with what he saw in the turn of the century, into the 20th century Palestine, and he saw it as a land where the Jewish people could finally come and restore their ancient heritage and live in freedom in a world that was still rocked with Western anti-Semitism. He was so enamored that he didn't notice, to use Shavit's words, that there was another people there, and that for the Jews to come meant the destruction of another people. And what Shavit writes is, had Bentwich seen, he would have turned around. And so although Shavit argues how important Israel is for him and his children and his family, He claims that Israel was created by taking somebody else's land and destroying another people. And when I read this line in that begins the jacket cover of your book, 700 Palestinians were forced out of their homes. It feeds this notion, this ideology of the American Jewish left, that maybe Israel should never have been created at all. As important that Israel is, as wonderful as Israel is, it was an immoral creation because it took somebody else's land and destroyed another people. So I'm asking you to explain to me, why did you write that Palestinians were forced out of their homes when nobody was called Palestinians? In fact, the only people called Palestinians in 1948 were the Jews. And how were they forced out?
So first on the issue of Palestinians, we struggled in terms of editorially whether to use the term. It's also throughout the book because indeed in the 1940s and 50s and pretty much into the 60s, the terms is Arabs, Arab refugees. This is how they refer to themselves.
I'm sorry. They being who referred to themselves how?
The people we now call Palestinians, if you look at writings from the 40s, the 50s,
Yes.
the 60s, the ones that we quote in the book, they describe themselves as Arabs, Arab refugees.
Correct.
Okay. But for editorial simplicity, we struggled with this issue and ultimately we made a footnote explaining that we use today's common understanding of who the Palestinians are throughout the book. And we include in a footnote that says, even though historically that was not the correct name in the 40s and 50s, for clarity, we use this because there is now a common understanding of what it means.
Okay, let me push you just one more moment.
Sure.
It's not simply a matter of nomenclature. There was no Palestinian people. It's not that there was a people, the Palestinians. They just called themselves something else. You know, historically, that's not true at all. That the people who were living in Palestine, first of all, many of them had come in to work from other countries, other Arab countries, to work for Israelis as Israel tried to build up the early chalutzim and the early kibbutzim. They were working, they came to find jobs. Most of them, those who were indigenous, considered themselves to be Syrians. It's not that it's not simply that you called the Palestinians, you called a different people by the name Palestinians. The reality was, Einat, there was nothing called or existing of a Palestinian people who just happened to have a different name.
So first, I want to separate a few things. We're not arguing with what the common name was in the 40s and 50s and 60s. In fact, I think one of the main things our book achieves is an answer to the question of when the Palestinian people were born and became a Palestinian people and nation in the sense that we understand it. And that is really in the refugee camps and in the UNRWA schools. That is really when it happens and coalesces.
Right.
And we detail that history, but we made a decision. And again, we struggled with it, and you can think it was the wrong decision, but we thought it made things simpler. Today, there is an understanding that Palestinians are the Arabs who were there. True, at the time, many Jews were called that. Today, this is understood. And in order to make it clear, we decided to use that with a clarifying footnote. And throughout the book, whenever they use quotes about themselves, of course, we use the terms that they use. But the history is very clear and throughout the book. And we're not saying the Palestinian people, we're saying Palestinians. Also, in terms of being forced, if you read the sentence to the end, it says by the war. not by Israel, not by the Jews, by the war.
Yes.
And in that sense, they were forced, because it's not the war ultimately forced them out. And indeed, how it was, many of them left of their own accord during the war. Again, no one pushed them out of the house. War came, and they decided that they wanted to leave. A lot of people currently left New York City to the Hamptons. They were forced to leave their homes by the plague. That is, a lot of Palestinians left because it was more comfortable to leave. That is the first stage. Then there was war and many forced, and there were expulsions. We do not deny that. But we make it very clear that it was in the context of war.
I was going to say, by the way, the story you tell in the book is much more sophisticated and nuanced. But had I been part of this process, I would have tried to show you that by putting this on the inside flap of your book, you would be misleading to many, many people who only would read the inside flap of your book. And what you're saying is, you didn't mean Palestinians, and you didn't mean forced the way everybody understands the word forced. And I want the audience to understand. You read the book, it's clear there were some, and just as, and this is fact, there were some communities which were expelled by the IDF and the decisions made by the Ben Gurion government, but that there were the overwhelming number of Arabs who left for various other reasons, not because at the point of a rifle, Israelis were forcing Arabs to leave. And in fact, they begged the Arab population, live with us in peace and be citizens. And it was only because the Arab community in 48 was convinced by their own leadership that the Jews were going to kill them, that everything was going to be a Der Yassin. So that they fled. But fled, Einat, is such a different word than forced.
Whatever were the reasons they fled, they were related to the war. But I just want to end my part on the issue of instead and other people. In that sense, Ari Shavit, of course, got it wrong. The early Zionists were very clear on the fact that there were some people living here, but you can blame them mostly for being naive, not even for being blind. They believed that given their good intentions to come and build, they would be welcomed, that there would be a partnership, and they also correctly assessed that there would be room for everyone. Because at the time, it was several tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and today we're more than 12 million.
Yes.
So they correctly assessed that there would be room, and that the economic development would make it possible for everyone. So they were not blind. Again, except for Jabotinsky, you might say that they were naive, but they were certainly not blind, and they did not mean to build their state instead. So this whole notion of being instead is precisely the propaganda that tries to present Israel as somehow born in original sin that can never be repented for.
Beautifully said. Adi, anything to add?
Yes, I would like to say something in a bit different angle. I think that the Jewish history, if you go back centuries, was so accustomed to being the complete victim, the complete powerless figure, standing against all these armies and pogroms, etc., etc. So there has been growing a notion that Jews are some kind of a complete angels, and everything they do has to be perfect and with no harm to anyone. And I think under those circumstances, even on the moon, you cannot build your state. I mean, if you look at the history of human beings, the history of nations, the history of religions, then the way nation states in Europe, outside of Europe, in Africa, not to mention the history of the United States, it was not and it was never a very easy process of just people saying, we want a state. Oh, really? Do you want that? So go and have it. No, we also struggled, the Jews also struggled, and they met with opposition, and they had a choice. I mean, without being personal, but the grandfather or the grand-grandfather of Mr. Shavit had somewhere to go back to. But other people who fled after the Holocaust or fled Iraq or Yemen had no opportunity to turn their backs and go anywhere. So with all due respect, their opportunities, as Einat said before, in 1948 was a battle for survival. So under those circumstances, I certainly can see and I certainly can understand the motivation, the actions of the Jews. They were fighting for a place under the sun. And they met an opposition who didn't want to grant them. Now, in terms of morality, one should ask and one should look at the status quo before that. Jews lived in Palestine or in the Holy Land, whatever you want to call it. Jews lived in the entire Middle East as a second-class or perhaps third or fourth-class citizens. It is not that everything was okay and all of a sudden all these Zionists came here and ruined everything. So I have a question. Let's say the grandparent of Mr. Shavit went back to Great Britain and the state of Israel never came into being. What would have happened to the million Jews who lived in the Middle East in 1945? Many of them in Iraq, in Yemen, in Morocco. Where did they go? Where would they go? No country, when Iraq kicked out its Jews in 1951, there was no country on earth who was willing to accept them. This is 6 years after the Holocaust. About 150,000 Jews had to flee Iraq. No country on earth was willing to accept them, except for the state of Israel. So Israel is a haven for all those Jews. And yes, they had to fight for it. They didn't get it for free. They had to fight for it when they met opposition. And Einat is completely right to note that when Herzl and Chaim Weizmann saw less than 1 million people living in this area, and by now we have more than 10 million, and many of them live quite prosperously, they were certainly right to see that many people have a room. The problem wasn't a room. The problem was that the population who was living here simply didn't want the Jews to have their own state. So I, for myself, don't see a world without a Jewish state as a more moral place than the current situation.
Very well said. And by the way, to be fair to Ari Shavit, he would have said much of what you said, that Israel was critical for the Jewish people, for his grandfather, obviously for the generation of the Shoah, obviously for Jews who were, as you say, second and third class citizens throughout the Middle East. His only point was that Israel was created on the back of the Palestinian people, and for him, that is it seems to be a moral issue that he can't get past. One more question in this line, Adi. I would love to know how you, what your position is on Israeli communities on the West Bank, on Judea, Samaria, what is called settlements, and it's a horrible misnomer because it describes something that doesn't exist. People should understand it's like Naples, Florida. It's like Teaneck, New Jersey. That's what these large communities are, but they're called settlements as if it's a hut and some kind of trailer. Anyway, I would like to know your position, and I would like to know your position on the concept of whether Israel is an occupying power. And one of the things also Shavit writes is, Israel is the only nation in the West that is occupying another people. The only nation in the West that is occupying another people. Is Shavit right, Adi? And what's your position in general on how the Jewish presence in Judea, Samaria on the West Bank?
Okay, so what I think is that, of course, the situation is here. We know that there is a unique situation, but if I would correct Shavit's words, I would say that Israel is the only country in the West whose existence is put in question by its neighbors. I mean, Denmark, Italy, the United States, nobody is questioning, not even the borders. Let's say that perhaps you will find in Eastern Europe some quarrels, but nobody says, okay, Poland should not exist or Romania should not exist. Israel is the only country, by the way, I'm not sure that only in the West, but certainly in the West, whose mere existence is in question. That is the reason that we have this ongoing conflict. Israel has not just one day invaded a country or somewhere just because of the fun of it, you know, holding a territory, occupying the people because they have this imperialist dream or these fantasies of grandeur. This is not the situation. We remember that the 1967 war, Jordan opened fire on Israel and not the other way around. So to me, you have to always ask yourself why. Why is there an occupation? Because they don't accept us, because they're unwilling, as we just mentioned and wrote a book about. They don't even recognize our right to be here. Now, regarding the settlements, I will tell you generally my position. My position is more pragmatic and more strategic. So, of course, everybody wants to have a largest country as he can. You know, we could have the entire Middle East, the entire world. That would be very nice. But we have to encounter reality on the ground. So for me, the presence of Israel, for example, on the Jordan Valley, to have a secure border, to be able to control the border by the IDF, defend ourselves by ourselves, is of extreme importance. I, for myself, and this is a personal choice, I don't think, or I don't see the great advantage, this is my personal preference, I don't see the great advantage of Jews living, certainly not inside, you know, big Arab cities such as Nablus, Ramallah, and Hebron. And I'll tell you why. At the end of the day, as Einat said in the beginning, and I accept that, I agree with that, there are Jews here and there are Arabs. Whether we call them Palestinians or you know, whatever we want to call them, they're certainly not Israeli Jews. Okay? And I, for myself, I don't want to be a minority under Arab rule. And I can understand if they say, we don't want to be a minority under a Jewish rule. So their self-rule, their self-determination, I accept that. For that reason, I don't see the advantage and I don't see the big, you know, thing about settling all over the place. However, this has to be said. At the current moment, the fact that the Israeli army and in large the Israeli security services are in charge in the area is extremely important. Right now, we cannot give it up. The civil presence of Jews in Judea and Samaria, for me, is of lesser importance. I understand and I know that there are many other Israeli Jews who think that is of extreme importance. For me, this is of lesser importance. My main occupation is the security of the state of Israel. I want to be free. I want to be alive. And I know that the IDF has to defend me. That's the main thing for me. That's the big issue.
Yes. But again, I agree with everything you say with one very minor caveat. Palestinian Arabs right now are very happy living as a minority inside Israel. And when they're asked if there were a two-state solution, would you like the border to put you into the Palestinian state? 99% say over my dead body. The Palestinian Arab is quite happy to live as a minority in Israel. By the way, he has complaints, and every minority has complaints. It's endemic to the human situation. But I understand why you don't want to live as a minority inside the Arab world. I don't think you're right when you say the Arabs don't want to live as a minority inside the Jewish world. They do it very happily, Adi.
I actually disagree with you. And I will tell you that while I do agree that they enjoy a higher standard of living, they have much better opportunities in terms of work, freedom of speech, freedoms, etc., etc. You don't have to convince me because I'm very happy here. But I don't think that at the end of the day, specifically if you look at the numbers, if you add the numbers of the Arabs living already inside the state of Israel, and if you add to that the Arabs who are living in Judea and Samaria, their sheer number brings us again back to those notions and ideology that at the end of the day, this land should be theirs. So I think that you have to differentiate between the short term of, oh, of course, we prefer, Israel has the rule of law, even if they have complaints, but, the judicial system of the PA, well, I prefer not to get there. So of course they prefer that, but I think that at the end of the day, their sentiment, as by the way, this is well proclaimed. So if you look at Arab intellectuals inside the state of Israel, they will also tell you that Israel is an imperialist endeavor, a colonial, whilst, leading the chair of the political science department in the University of Haifa. Okay, so they are very happy with it. They fly all around the world, and good for them. If they're doing a good job, then it's good. But I wouldn't conflate the short-term benefits and the short-term good life that they can enjoy in the state of Israel with the longer-term, desire of, at the end of the day, to put an end to this aberration of history and go back to a Muslim rule over the entire country.
Okay. And Nat, do you want to say anything about settlements and occupation and any of the issues that Adi has just addressed?
Look, close to ID. It's also a bit to what you said in the beginning. The fact that the Palestinians do not want to make peace based on a vision of two states, one for the Jewish people and one for the Arab Palestinians, to me in no way makes any logical connection with why we need to settle inside heavily populated Arab areas. Personally, I think the Israeli settlement project has been our greatest waste of resources. I don't see how it's advanced us in any way. I can very well explain why this is not the reason we don't have peace, precisely because, even if all settlements were to disappear tomorrow, because the Palestinians want the state of Israel, that's not why we don't have peace. But for our purposes, for the state of Israel, I genuinely think it's been a complete waste of some of our best resources. I don't see the purpose of it. And even if it takes however long it takes for the Palestinians, at the end of the day, I'm a die-hard old school Zionist. For me, the question of sovereignty for the Jewish people is far, far, far more important than whether the state of Israel will have sovereignty on each and every square inch that is related to Jewish history. And in that sense, I'm more than happy to live safely and securely in a smaller state of Israel where I enjoy a comfortable long-term majority rather than pursue some biblical dreams. So that's my view on the settlements. And on the occupation, people forget that occupation is certainly not a dirty word. The Allies occupied Germany for 45 years before they ended the occupation. An occupation is a legal form of governing a territory acquired by war until its final status is settled. So I don't see anything wrong with that once you put it in context. But then people say, well, your occupation is very long. And then that I agree with Adi. The question is why? Why is the Israeli military occupation so long? Because the Palestinians again and again and again reject opportunities to end the occupation by means of agreement, because what they seek is not to end Israel's military presence in the West Bank. What they seek is to end Israel's presence, period.
I think the two of you are fabulous. You've written a wonderful book, which I hope all of our audience goes out and gets. It's available on Amazon. It's like $25. It's called The War of Return. It's by Einat Wilf. It's by Adi Schwartz. But more than that, the two of you are lovely people. You're thoughtful people, by the way. It's most wonderful to be lovely. But it's also so wonderful when one comes across lovely people who are also thoughtful and bright and caring. And the two of you are clearly that. I hope there are many opportunities I have to turn to either or both of you for other opinion and insight on issues dealing with the state of Israel and with Jewish life as a whole. At the moment, I only want to wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha, only wonderful success with your book. And I hope you and your families survive this crazy time of coronavirus in health, that you are well, everybody you love is well. And I'll say it again, I hope that there's a time when I get to meet you in person one day. But in the meantime, that you'll let me call upon you anytime I think you could add to the discussion. You are wonderful for giving us so much time on JBS. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. It was a great opportunity to discuss our book and all the issues around it.
Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz, who've written a most important book, The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. And of course, it's available on Amazon. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you have to any of the ideas expressed on this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me at rabbigolub@jbstv.org or write me at Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut, 06904. And remember, you can now listen to the L'Chaim podcast and take L'Chaim with you everywhere you go. And so until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.